Welcome everybody to Alexandria, Virginia. I'm standing outside of the Carlyle House. Now the Carlyle House was built by a man named John Carlyle sometime between 1750 and 1753. We actually know he moved in here with his wife August 1st of 1753. 2 years later is actually when a British general named Edward Braddock came here. March of 1755. It's one of the first major military campaigns of the French and Indian War, or what in Europe is known as the 7 Years' War. Officially in Europe lasted from 1756 to 1763. Now when Braddock came here, his mission was to go across the Allegheny Mountains and attack the French who had just set up a fort called Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River. It's where we associate modern-day Pittsburgh with. In fact, the name Pittsburgh comes from the fact that British actually take Fort Duquesne in 1758 under the Loudon Campaign. They set up another fort that they called Fort Pitt, named after William Pitt the Elder, who was really the architect behind the British defeat of the French during the French and Indian War. Now when Braddock came here, he had about 1,600 soldiers. It's 2 regiments that he had. They weren't some of the highest trained regiments, but the British are sending them here because they are believed to be more professional, way more professional than the provincial army or the provincial regiment here that was led by George Washington. Now, Washington had suffered a military defeat the summer before this at a battle called the Battle of Fort Necessity. Irony of that battle is he actually surrendered the fort on July 4th of 1754. He then came back to Alexandria, he came back to Virginia. He was eventually recruited by Braddock's staff to become an aide-de-camp. He was a volunteer aide-de-camp to General Braddock. Now, if you think about George Washington's military background, his military experience, this is one of the first times that he's actually serving under a very notable general. He's actually serving in a professional army. He's seeing how a professional staff functions, so he's actually getting a lot of experience firsthand during the Braddock Campaign in 1755. Now, Braddock actually has a meeting here at John Carlyle's house. The meeting takes place a little over a couple weeks after he gets here. He actually has this meeting with 5 royal governors. Governors from Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, Governor Sharp from Maryland, Governor from New York, Governor from Pennsylvania, and a governor from Massachusetts that George Washington really looked up to, Governor Shirley. Now during this meeting here, the Alexandria Conference, or what John Carlyle called the grandest Congress that took place here, April of 1755, they do discuss the military strategy behind Braddock's campaign. Fort Duquesne was just one phase of the campaign. In fact, the campaign was meant to go all the way up to push the French out of Canada. So Braddock was just looking at Fort Duquesne as basically being phase 1 of this campaign. Now, like a lot of wars, this one was very expensive. And Braddock's issues is that he was finding that the colonies were not willing to voluntarily pony up funds. So they were dragging their feet in terms of financing this campaign. That's when the governors and Braddock actually came up with a novel idea. The idea that they started to discuss was Parliament, taxing the colonists. Now keep in mind, this is 1755. It's 2 decades before the American Revolution begins, with a shot heard around the world, the Battle of Lexington, Concord, on April 19th, 1775. So if you think about it, 20 years before the Revolutionary War began, and at the beginning of the French and Indian War, we have right here in Alexandria, Virginia, a lot of high-level discussions about taxation without representation. We won't say these are the first discussions about this, but considering this is one of the largest and most noteworthy assemblies here in 1755 with the 5 royal governors and General Braddock, this is one of the more notable meetings in which taxing the colonists as a way to pay for the French and Indian War was first being proposed. Now, John Carlyle could not have been happier when Braddock left in April of 1755, shortly after this Alexandria Conference took place. We know from the writings of Carlyle to his brother that he thought Braddock was a very indolent man. He described him as a slave to his passions, including wine and women, as great an epicure as could be in his eating. He also mentioned that the British treated us as the spawn of convicts and that they used us like an enemy country, abused my property, and left me nothing in return. We have an occasion here in which we notice 20 years before the Revolutionary War, a feeling of American colonists being treated as second-class citizens. So it's no shock that John Carlyle would himself very much opposed British years later. John Carlyle was a signer of a document called the Fairfax County Resolves. That document was actually passed here in Alexandria at what used to be the Fairfax County Courthouse that was right across the street from John Carlyle's house. Now, John Carlyle was one of 25 signers of this document. There were 24 resolves. They were all speaking against what the British were doing in terms of shutting down the port of Boston and imposing the coercive or intolerable acts in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. There were 25 signers of this document from Fairfax County. Half of them were from Alexandria. The chairman of the meeting in which this document, the Fairfax Resolves, was signed and passed was actually George Washington. George Mason of Gunston Hall was the principal author. Now, George Mason would follow this document up 2 years later, June of 1776, when the Virginia Convention passed the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The Virginia Declaration of Rights was a blueprint for the Declaration of Independence and for the U.S. Bill of Rights that would be ratified several years later, 1791. George Mason's imprint on our founding documents in America can go all the way back to one of his most notable documents, the Fairfax County Resolves, that was passed right here in Alexandria, Virginia, 251 years ago now, July 18th of 1774. We have a lot of amazing history here in Alexandria, Virginia, on the road to America's Revolution. If you're looking for one place to celebrate and to remember America's 250th next year, definitely come here to Alexandria, 6 miles from our nation's capital. We're doing Revolutionary War tours all year round, every day, multiple times a day. We'd be happy to talk with you more about this history and get more in depth with John Carlyle, George Washington, the history of Alexandria, and the history of our great country.